Hello, AP US Sister students. It's Mr. Baker again. Hope you're doing well. This is lesson 1 of Unit 1 that covers the exploration of the Americas before the settlement of Jamestown. So we're going to focus most of our attention on the settlement related to Spanish and Portuguese influence, and then we'll transition next week and the week after to our focus on Unit 2. So let's go ahead and get started. The question I like to start off with students is, first of all, those of you that are new to AP are finding that there's a big focus on what we as history teachers and historians also refer to as contextualization. With this, what I want to encourage our students to do is to basically think about before and also after things that are happening, but a couple of kind of little quick reminders with thinking about the basic nuts and bolts of contextualization, and that is think about change from and or continuity with preceding historical developments and or similarities and or differences with contemporaneous historical developments in different regions or geographical places. Okay, this is particularly important with Unit 1 as we start to look at the settlements related to civilizations in places like South America, in more Central America, the kind of Native American civilizations like the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas, also compared or contrasted to those that you'll see in the American Southwest, the American Pacific Northwest, parts within, and then also the Northeast. Okay, so the big thing is we want to be able to explain the context for European encounters in the Americas from 1491 to 1607. Now, the focus of today's lesson is going to be mostly on the diverse societies that have developed prior to European settlement. Okay, so it's very easy for us to be like, well, the civilization existed and they were all, in some cases, unique. What we want to understand is how were they unique? Now, we're not going to have time to get through all of them today, but we'll kind of look at some nuts and bolts. And then the second thing we want to look at is what are going to be some of the things that caused or led to the colonization or exploration in the New World by many of these countries, right? So think about the world history that some of you, if you've had it thus far, studied with, when you look at Columbus and Pizarro and Cortez and other people like that, Prince Henry the Navigator, of course, of Portugal, very important. A lot of students ask the question, about, the Bering Strait and obviously the importance of that land bridge that eventually led to a lot of the settlement. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but just keep in mind you're looking at a way that some of these first Americans are going to make their way, of course, to the Americas. And there's a lot to say about that. But what we want to focus our attention on are 3 big overarching themes with today's lesson. First of all, we want to understand how various Native American populations prior to, that's the key word, ladies and gentlemen, prior to European contact interacted with their natural environments. So we're looking at one of the big themes, which is geography, environment, and how that's going to play a role with settlement. The second thing we want to look at is explain how Native American civilization had diverse societies in the Americas. And these are all going to impact economic development, social development, and then of course also political development. Okay, so I want students to really kind of put their noggins to work today a lot. What does it mean when we say diverse? Okay, hold on to that for a moment and we'll come back to that. And then thirdly, and very importantly, the causes of exploration. How does this idea of wealth, metals, gold, silver, things like that, all right, resources, how does that lead to military competition, the idea of economic competition, and a desire to also spread religion, all right, and Christianity and other forms of that, particularly into the New World? And how does that create competition and even rivalry, you could argue, between some of these countries? Okay, so a lot of students, these are not charts that you necessarily have to memorize, but you might want to pause this video for a moment to kind of look at them for a few seconds. But the question a lot of people have is, what is the population of the New World basically compared to a lot of the rest of the world? Well, first of all, when we're talking about the New World, Keep in mind, we're talking about North America, part of Mexico, Central America, Hispaniola, the Caribbean, the Andes, and also other parts of South America. Now, keep in mind, these are estimates, right? If you look at these in different texts, you'll find that there's a variety of different sources of information out there that will give you maybe varying numbers. But where I want to look at, guys, is when we're looking at North America, all right, which is going to be mostly where, when you focus on the United States, places like that, okay, even parts of Canada as well, you're looking at a reasonably small portion of that overall population in the New World compared to that almost 55 million people that, according to this estimate, comprised it. Now, if you take a look at the next estimate here, again, don't memorize, but just kind of think, guys, when you look at historical information, you want to be thinking, okay, well, the big picture here is the world has a total of about 467 million people, give or take. The Americas, again, a little bit of a different estimate than the one on the left, but very similar, is about 54 million people. Okay, so if you do the math there, that is about, roughly anyway, about a ninth of the world's total population that is actually in the Americas, right? So what is that, like 11.1% or something along those lines? Those are things that we want to think about because, as we probably already know, but just to reiterate, guys, this idea of connection and interaction between European cultures and, of course, Native American cultures is drastically going to impact their population, not just from the standpoint of numbers, but also from the standpoint of, obviously, a lot of different, what I like to call, cultural landscapes. Okay, so when we're looking at really the settlements that probably get the most attention from the standpoint of, established civilizations in larger areas, you really almost always think of the Aztecs, the Mayas, and then also the Incas. Okay, so I want you to think, for those of you guys that have already started to look at your reading and processing it, what are some things that define those larger civilizations? When we say larger, as far as numbers, things like that, permanent settlements that basically were not as likely to move, kind of like what you would find with nomadic cultures in some parts of the North American side. Okay, and what you're looking at is you're looking at a lot of things that basically make us think complex societies. Okay, so large urban centers. So when you're thinking of the Aztecs, right, you think of Tenochtitlan, otherwise known as Mexico City. Okay, when we're thinking of the Incas, right, we're thinking of Cusco, right, places that have great centers for things like, libraries and academic resources and things like that. Those are all things that are going to eventually make them large urban centers. Okay, highly ritualized religions. Okay, this is another thing that added to the complexity of a lot of these religious groups. Okay, a lot of them, of course, a lot of are going to be based around a lot of nature, natural things. Okay, polytheistic practices that are going to be, in a lot of ways, very different than the kind of religion that is going to be brought over from, of course, a lot of the parts of Europe with Christian denominations and backgrounds, whether it's Roman Catholicism or whether, on the other hand, it is Protestant denominations like you would find in England and other parts of Europe. Okay, and then complex political systems. Okay, think about that. What is meant by a complex anything, but in this case, a complex political system? We're talking about organized ways of society having almost like a hierarchy of leadership. All right, and how is that going to impact these different settlements before European contact arrives? Okay. So just a couple of details, guys. Not going to go over this in a lot of depth. By the way, keep in mind your outline is available for you to look at with objectives and also the basic course framework. But again, you see 1325, you have this large city that eventually is going to house in the modern day, millions of people. You're looking at semi-nomadic warriors. Okay, what does that really mean? You're talking about the idea of people that moved, but they're not going to be as maybe reliant on movement as you would find with some tribes, let's say in parts of North America that would hunt the bison or buffalo and things like that. Okay. You do have a hierarchy of social structure, priests, nobles. When we think of priests, we want to be thinking of religious leaders that have a lot of influence. Okay. So that's not just going to be unique when you think of religious leadership. That's not going to be just unique to looking at, leadership within the Catholic Church, which is certainly going to have things to say about the influence of Spanish settlement, right? That'll be a focus of what we do in session 2. Okay, commoners, serfs, and then also enslaved people. Okay, I know a lot of times when we think of, the enslavement of 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 um, things related to exploration and eventually colonization in especially British North America. We think of, bringing over, people that were, from Western Africa for a lot of different reasons, particularly, really agricultural plantation work. But you notice, guys, that is not just unique to that. Okay. Human sacrifices. Again, you're looking at things that are going to define religious practices. And then economically, all right, keep your noggin in mind, guys. You want to be thinking of social, economic, political things. You're looking at maize, right, as a very important good that's eventually going to become a pretty significant part of that eventual, what we call the Columbian Exchange. All right, that'll be a focus of next lesson. In fact, the first part of it. Okay, and then beans and squash. So again, additional things that define the economy. But not just that, you're looking at making things like pottery, clothing, okay, textiles, in a fairly primitive way compared to what we'll see in the later days when we move into time period 3 and also especially time period 4. Okay, and so when you're looking at the Mayans again, right, a civilization that's relatively close in proximity to the Aztecs, all right, large cities. Now, the thing that's interesting, you're looking at technology, not that we don't see that with Aztecs, but irrigation, very important, right? When you're looking at the idea of bringing a water resource to an area where, maybe there's a limit to it or whatever. And then also, again, very neat observation, the idea of things that we associate with math and science and things like that, hieroglyphical writing, right? So we're starting to move into a kind of writing that has some written form to it, right? So very important to keep in mind. And then the Incas. Now keep in mind, geography here, which is going to be a big fixture of environment and how these people adapt to it, is going to be pretty important. When we look at the Incas, the Andes Mountains, which is obviously along the Pacific coast. We'll look at a couple of maps here in a moment to kind of show us a little bit more with location. Okay. And here's the interesting thing, 16 million people are going to be a part of this civilization. If you go back to the previous estimates, 54 million is approximately what we'll see. What is that? About a little bit more than about 1 out of every 3 or less, excuse me. So between 1 out of every 3 and 1 out of every 4. So this is a sizable group of people. Okay. Again, we're seeing the effects of their geography, irrigation, terraces, potato cultivation, mining, which a lot of times when we think of slave labor being more related to agriculture, believe it or not, as we'll see here in a moment in more detail, you see a lot of emphasis on that. And then again, human sacrifice as a part of their religious system. Okay. And so the question is, where do we really see a lot of these settlements of these Native American groups, right? Well, here's where you're looking at, obviously, the, some of the civilizations that we associate with Aztecs, Mayans, which would be more, close to Guatemalan civilization, Yucatan Peninsula. And then I don't have it here, but we'll look at it here in a moment. As you move into, of course, parts of South America, that's where you're going to see Incan civilizations. Okay, but as we saw before, this is where you're seeing a lot of diversity with these Native American civilizations. The thing that I want my students or these students to think about is how are all these different groups Okay, we're not going to look at all of them in detail, but we'll look at a few of them as examples. How are all these different groups going to adapt to their geographic environment? Environment is the key word, right? Whether they're, along the eastern seaboard of current day United States or the North America here, or whether or not they're Pacific Northwest here, or whether or not, as you can see here, whether they're in this part of kind of like the middle Great Plains, Central Plains region, they're all going to have things that define them, economically, social, politically, and other ways, religiously to an extent as well. We'll look at that more in a second. Okay, so Native American peoples, as we just said, very important between about 500 and 1500 BCE, excuse me. All right, you'll notice again, Aztecs, Mayans, and then again, these other civilizations that are basically going to very strongly define some of the other groups. Now, keep in mind, many of these groups are going to be smaller as far as their size compared to what you would see with like the Aztecs, the Mayans, and then also the Incans, so it could be further down there. Okay, and that's pretty important, right? How's that going to affect their societies in many different ways? Well, let's take a look at one example with the Pueblo. Okay, so the Pueblos you can see here, excuse me, is going to be pretty significant when you're looking at some areas of this part of our civilizations, right? So present day Utah and Colorado, right? So we're looking at, again, a piece of what we would call current day United States, okay? So farm maize, bean, and squash. So again, they're going to be very agricultural in their own way. Irrigation, right? So they have a complex system of trying to bring, a resource that we know is vital to farming, water, in other words. And then, as you'll see here, again, you could look at this as social, adobe brick homes, digging into cliffs, things like that. Okay, those are all going to be things that in some ways are reflective of how do they adapt to their environment. Okay, another example, if you're looking at the northeast of North America in this sense, you're looking at semi-sedentary villages. All right, so some of them are going to be more established than others. Again, what are we noticing? We're seeing a consistency in some ways with agriculture, maize, squash, and beans. Now, the variation here is when we're looking at hunting and gathering kinds of civilizations, deer hunting and fishing. Okay, so you're looking at societies that have access to a variety of different waterways. Okay, Pacific Northwest, you would see a lot of fishing there too because of the nature of where those civilizations or cultures, pardon me, are going to be located. And then matrilineal. Think about this. Why is that important? What does that mean? Okay, very much along the lines of a lot of influence from especially the mother side with society. Now, the thing I want you all to think about for next class period is how do you think this might impact a civilization or a culture coming over from a part of Europe, like the Spanish or the Portuguese or eventually the British and other groups that tend to not have as much emphasis in their social structure with the idea of matrilineal. In other words, they're going to be more patrilineal. How are those cultures going to either adapt or in some cases maybe even resist those kinds of differences? That's really important to kind of think about as we move forward. Okay, just a real quick thing about the Iroquois League of Five Nations. You hear about this a lot. The Mohawk, Oneida, etc., Seneca. This is a group that came together. A lot of the reason for that was almost like a defense network, you could argue, against some elements of influence from other cultures. And they're going to do a lot of things. I mean, they're going to create kind of like an early form of a constitution, right? That if you study constitutional history down the line, if you already haven't, you notice that there's a big emphasis on the idea of the influence of that constitution with even down the line American constitutional thought. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Mr. Baker, this is certainly before the 1780s, right, when America is trying to put together this famous constitution that eventually replaces the Articles of Confederation. While that is true, it doesn't take away the fact that a lot of different influences go into thinking about how to govern. Okay, so keep that in mind. When you're looking, for example, at some of these other Native American cultures, the picture here, okay, many of our early documents of some of these earlier civilizations, a lot of times, are pictures that illustrate how they developed the mounds. An example of that would be, like you'll notice, this is Locust Grove, Ohio. I grew up a little bit outside of this in a place called Chillicothe, Ohio. You ever go to Chillicothe, Ohio? It's very neat to go to the Mound City, which is basically a Hopewell Mound. It's actually a historic site, which you get to actually look at what did these mounds basically look like, right? Which goes back to religious emphasis and influence. Okay, so that's kind of a basic run through of diversity in some of these early Native American, civilizations and also tribes and things or groups. Now, the question that we want to look at for the rest of our time today, for the most part, is what are the reasons for European settlement, right? A lot of times you almost always hear, what are those three things? God, gold, and also glory. Okay, while there's a lot to be said about those three influences, there's a little bit more to it than just those three words. So this is where we get started again. So all of you have probably heard of the Renaissance. What comes to mind when a lot of times we think of the Renaissance? We think of Michelangelo, Leonardo, right? We think of people that made, their mark by, doing things like drawings and paintings and certainly, sculptures. And while that's all true, what I want you all to think about is that when we're looking at this, we also need to focus on the fact that this time period is really going to also make the rest of the world, or at least many parts of it, connect in different ways. Okay, you're going to see, like, for example, a lot of you are familiar also if you go back and you study the Reformation with Johannes Gutenberg and the famous printing press. We see a lot of new technology, right? We see a lot of interaction between a variety of different civilizations and cultures, okay? And so those things are going to be a very big factor that leads to European interest in finding new routes to different parts of the world and eventually, of course, moving and settling, all right? So what is the Renaissance? The cultural and intellectual flowering that began in the 15th century in Italy, okay? And European rulers pushed for greater political unification of their states. Now, keep in mind, if you've ever heard of the expression nation state, what are we really seeing? We're seeing the development of a lot of these places, like Spain is going to be united under the rule of Ferdinand Isabella. We see obviously the more formal establishment of Portugal. Italy is kind of, developing that along the way. Britain, France, other nation states that are basically having a lot of unity. Now, nationalism plays a big role with this, right? They all have an interest in expanding their culture, whether it's political, economic, social, and also, of course, religious, which a lot of those things go together. And what do they want to do? Well, they want to basically make it to where their power is going to be heavily shown through conquest and also exploration. Okay, so the idea of efforts to find new trade routes and also to explore the new world, but you can't take away the fact that missionaries and also, of course, merchants are going to bring back a lot of these things that they're exposed to. Okay, so again, one of the things that we'll look at next time in a little bit of detail is, when you start to see more additional European contact with a lot of these civilizations in the Americas, everybody's probably heard, at least in principle, the Columbian Exchange. There is an exchange of a lot of things. Now, a lot of those things are going to be, animals and agricultural things, etc. But there's also a lot of an exchange of ideas, whether it's religious or economic or whatever it might be. Okay. And Europe is going to really, I would argue, have a lot of benefits and also a lot of results of this, just like in some ways the Americas will. Now, let's face the facts. There are pros to this contact, and there are a lot of potential downsides. Downsides meaning, epidemics are going to be brought across the pond, as I like to say, the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic world is going to vastly change with our knowledge of European contact. And unfortunately, we know that those numbers of Native American settlements will drastically go down by, of course, large numbers. Okay, but you're looking at the idea of interaction. Okay, so we'll look at that more in a second. Trade will be expanded. Okay, so this kind of shows you, again, this contact that's going on. Now, I don't know if it's necessary to memorize every single, as we look at here in a moment, explorer. Certainly a few of them would be worthy of at least seeing their influence, but as we're taking a look here, we're looking at, again, Venice and current day Italy, but back then the Italian area. Okay, so you're noticing, again, Genoa as well, you're noticing a lot of these connections. When we think of Constantinople, right? It's eventually going to be, the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. Eventually, of course, we know that the Ottoman Empire is going to be heavily important. All those kinds of things are going to bring additional interactions as far as you can see, as far eastward as China, right? So a lot of goods like silk, etc. And it's like, man, also Delhi and India, as you can see, Europeans want access to this. And therefore, they're going to start to do a lot more venturing. Okay, so you can see that again, 1491, why do we start off this unit the year before Christopher Columbus? We want to understand the status of civilization prior to him coming here. And we also want to be able to understand the results of it by the time we start to look at British North American settlement in Jamestown, which is where we pick up with our next unit. Okay. So examples of this: long distance trade. Couple of examples. Technology is a huge part of what's going to really give these Europeans a lot of influence. So the caravel, you can stop and pause this if you want to write a couple of things down. Okay, but again, we're looking at what allows these ships to be able to make a lot of those ventures around, parts of Africa and so forth, because a lot of times, guys, they could not do this efficiently and effectively before a lot of this new technology. Okay, and then you'll see Portugal, right, who I realize, okay, we talk a lot about Spanish settlement, but Portugal is pretty important as well, all right, in this unit, and we'll get to them a little bit more next unit too. Portugal traded, as you could see in the previous map, parts of Africa, India, Indonesia, right, China, and then also in Japan. All right, so we're looking at what is going to give, again, I like to use the word curiosity here. What is going to give these European nations a curiosity about finding different routes to make them more efficient? And, a lot of you guys have probably heard the reference, Columbus made the most famous mistake of all time. In a lot of ways, that's true. Okay, but the result of that is going to be massive. Okay, now Spain, again, this Inquisition, to basically try to take back a degree of, shall we say, identity with, the Catholic Church and so forth. So the Inquisition becomes pretty important. Again, they're going to be heavily desiring these additional trade routes as well. North Africa, India, and Asian islands or lands. Okay. But the big thing you hear about is the spread of religion, Catholicism. Now, the big debate with this that we'll look at a little bit more next time is when you start to look at some of the church leadership that kind of start to evaluate, the way that Spain and other countries, but particularly Spain, are impacting things. Now, this is not on the next slide, but just keeping this in mind, you're looking at population growth, a lot of different things. Military is expanding. Couple of things that we need to keep in mind. By a few years after Columbus's voyages, right, we have a rivalry that's developed between Spain and Portugal. And that rivalry is basically over the New World, who's going to get parts of it, you know. And this is where the Catholic Church, I'll bring a little bit more religion in here, but it's important, guys. This is where the Catholic Church, you know, the Pope at the time, is going to have to really say, okay, do I want two Catholic nations going to war against each other? And really the answer to that is you're probably better off, according to him, to have more harmony. Therefore, you're going to have eventually the Treaty of Tordesillas. I believe it was 1494 that was signed. And so Spain is going to get a certain portion of the New World to the west. And then basically Portugal is going to get a certain portion of the New World to the east, which basically, in a sense, gives them control of what we associate with current day Brazil, right? And even though, you know, Spain's colonies will eventually start to go through a process of independence and freedom, the one thing that we notice is that the same thing happens with Brazil. I believe it was 1822, if I'm not mistaken, where Brazil eventually is going to go in that direction. Okay. So Europeans at the Atlantic, just keep in mind, just a couple of fun facts here before Columbus's voyages. Late 10th century, this is where you have some debate about, you know, who should really be given credit for this New World discovery, right? That's for you all to land your plane on. But we know that the Vikings get some attention with Eric the Red. But for the most part, we see a lot of attention brought to Columbus. Okay, as I said before, the big thing here is a westward route to the Indies. Of course, we know that that's not really what he found, but you know, he goes on several different ventures. The last one gets a lot of attention with the encomienda system that we'll talk more about later. But what do we find? Well, you know, it's kind of like Columbus was almost like, you know, if you want to, those of you that might like NASCAR, you know, you get sponsored as a driver. Well, Columbus was, of course, Italian and was sponsored by the Spanish crown, right? So he's, you know, it's like, hey, look at what I found for y'all. He's trying to bring prestige to the crown, but he's also trying to show what he did to, you know, certainly support his legacy. Okay. And so what do we notice? Well, after Columbus's first voyage, what do we notice? Well, that's going to prompt a lot more voyages. Okay. And so again, Jacques Cartier, you know, as you can see, 1534, John Cabot, excuse me, Henry Hudson, Columbus, of course, another venture, Amerigo Vespucci, right? A lot of you guys know, you know, that's the guy that, you know, a lot of people give credit for figuring out that the Americas were separate, right? And so you notice, you know, even Coronado, Cabrillo, De Soto, right? So you're noticing that even afterwards, right, that's quite a bit down the line, at least somewhat after Columbus, you're noticing a lot of these different explorers trying to get more into, I guess, what some people would call the interior, right? Parts of, you know, Southwest, current day Southwest United States, parts of furthering into Mexico, and then also this area close to the Mississippi River. Okay. And so as you can see here, all right, again, going back to our civilizations, you're noticing again that idea of a lot of things that are going to prompt this European settlement economically, right? The mining that you see in parts of Hispaniola, parts of northern South America, and then as you can see here, also parts of the Incan civilization. Okay, moving downward. Okay, and so that's very important that we kind of keep in mind that you're going to continue to see that, right? And so by the earlier, you know, 17th century, right, 1600s plus, this is where we see a lot more importance. Now, a lot of you might be wondering, okay, well, Mr. Baker, you mentioned, you know, that Columbus finds the New World. You know, what is going to be really a big reason why we see even more competition with parts of Britain? Well, we'll look at this a little bit later, but at the end of, toward the end of the 16th century, Spain was like, man, we want to be the top dog And the way to do that is naval strength, right? So I think it was King Philip II that was like, you know what, we're going to go out and we're going to create this armada, right? We call it the Spanish Armada, that really cannot be toppled, right? Almost like those of you who are familiar with the Titanic story. Well, in 1588, you know, the Armada is basically proved to be defeatable, right? And that's what we find is that the British eventually, you know, are going to really gain a lot of momentum and also a lot of power as a result of pretty much, you know, sinking the Armada, right? So that's going to change the course of exploration or colonization as well, right? So just kind of keep, as my mom used to say, in your noggin, some of those ideas, okay? So just a real quick thing for those of you that are like, okay, you know, what is a good basic list of some of these really important explorers? Now, keep in mind, some of these are going to represent the Spanish crown. Some of them are going to represent France, like Symbol de Champlain. Others are going to represent the crown of England, right? So I don't know if it's necessary to memorize every single one of these, but certainly understanding the role that they have. And as you'll see here, these are all going to be in historical order, right? So we look at Columbus, then John Cabot, and then as we move down here, you know, we start to see like Hudson becoming pretty important. And then as you can see toward the end of the 17th century, you notice that Marquette, Joliet, okay, they're all going to be pretty much involved. And again, getting further into the North Americas. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with a few things to think about for next time if you're in my class. First of all, your summer assignment, that should have been the 3 documents. Please make sure that you've submitted that to Canvas in either Word or PDF format. If you're in fact, if you in fact typed it, if you hand wrote it, you can simply send screenshots. Please make sure that they're visible and readable, excuse me. Okay, you're going to want to complete your reading quiz on chapter 1. This is something that you will want to do by the end of class tonight, or the day tonight. This will be 5 questions. One of them is going to be related to a historian argument on something that you've read and that we probably have talked about a little bit today. 2 of the questions will relate to primary sources that relate to excerpts, all right? So actual documents that were published by, you know, probably explorers and the crown. And then 2 of those questions are going to be related to primary sources that actually have visuals, whether they're pictures or maps or something like that. The caveat to that is that there's 5 questions, but you want to make sure that you're able to score a 40 out of 50. In other words, 80% for what we call mastery. Okay, you can take that at least a second time. My suggestion is if you don't score what you need to the first time, go back, review possibly your readings, your notes, your content, in other words, and then look at a second try. If you don't get it on the second try, then probably a good thing to do would be to contact me, and we'll try to set up maybe a time to walk through and try to remediate a little bit more. Okay. Read the skills focus for Wednesday. So you'll notice you should be doing something. What is the thing we said in the introduction? It's a 5-day approach for at least 30 minutes a day. So you're going to be reading 2 things that deal with skills. One is going to be effective note-taking. The second one is going to be how to break down a primary source. Now, I realize that I asked you all to do a primary source assignment as a summer work. All right, that was to kind of give me an idea where you are entering the class. The one that you submit for Thursday, which is a separate assignment, that's going to be from the fabric text. And you're going to be looking at about 4 or 5 short documents. Please use those principles to basically focus on. Now, we're going to have a lot of practice this year, but it's always good to kind of get in the framework of starting off and putting these into practice so that we can kind of see where we are and move forward. If you need anything, please feel free to contact me at baker@freedomclinicacademy.org. Our next session will focus on the Columbian Exchange, the effects more so of Spanish settlement and official contact with the native populations, and also the results of those contacts. Thank you. Be safe. This is Baker's Backyard and Corner signing off. Hope you all have a great day.